Standing at the monstrous height of 6 feet, 5 inches, and weighing in at almost 300 pounds, he was extremely intimidating, and higher-ups in the family took notice. He was put to the test when a random man was selected on the street. He walked up to the man walking a dog and shot him in the back of the head. His name was Richard Kuklinski, and later dubbed the Iceman. As always, don't forget to subscribe to the Past Crimes channel if you want to stay up to date with crimes of the past, and hit the bell icon to get notifications. Richard Kuklinski was born in his family's apartment on 4th Street in Jersey City, New Jersey, to Stanley Kuklinski, a Polish immigrant from Karwaks, Masovian Voivodeship. His father worked as a brakeman for the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. His mother, Anna McNally of Harsimus, was a devoutly Catholic first-generation Irish-American who worked in a meatpacking plant. Richard was the second of 4 children. According to Richard Kuklinski, his father Stanley was a violent alcoholic who regularly beat his children and occasionally beat his wife. Stanley left the family while Richard was still a child, but returned on a regular basis, usually drunk, and his visits were frequently followed by more beatings for Richard. Anna Kuklinski was allegedly abusive as well. She used broom handles and other household items to beat Richard. He recalled a time when his mother tried to kill his father with a kitchen knife when he was a child. Anna believed that strict discipline should be accompanied by a strict religious education. Richard saw his mother as a cancer who destroyed everything she touched. Richard had 3 siblings, one of whom, Joseph, was convicted in 1970 of raping and murdering a 12-year-old girl by throwing her and her dog off the top of a 5-story building. When asked about his brother's crimes, he responded, "We come from the same father." Richard worked at a Manhattan film lab in the mid-1960s. He gained access to master copies of popular films through the lab, and he made bootleg copies of Disney animated films to sell. He also discovered a lucrative market for pornographic movie tapes. Copying and distributing pornography provided him with a consistent source of income. He was arrested once for passing a bad check, which was the only crime he was charged with prior to his murder arrest. Richard was fingerprinted and photographed, but the charges were dropped after he agreed to repay the money owed. Richard also headed a burglary group with Gary Smith, Barbara Debner, Daniel Debner, and Percy House. Richard killed George Maliband on January 30, 1980, during a meeting to sell him tapes. Maliband was carrying $27,000 at the time, according to reports. A week later, on February 5, 1980, Maliband's body was discovered. He had dumped the body in a 55-gallon drum near the Chemetex chemical plant in Jersey City. He severed Maliband's tendons in order to fit the corpse into the barrel. In 1982, Richard met Paul Hoffman, a 51-year-old pharmacist who visited the store in Paterson, New Jersey, a storefront with a back room stocked with stolen goods for sale. Hoffman hoped to make a lot of money by buying stolen Tagamet, a popular drug used to treat peptic ulcers, and reselling it through his pharmacy. He was convinced Richard could supply the drugs and pressed him to strike a deal. Hoffman was last seen driving to Richard's house with $25,000 in cash to buy prescription drugs. According to Richard, he lured Hoffman into a rented garage and attempted to shoot him, but the gun jammed. Instead, he murdered Hoffman with a tire iron. He then stuffed the body into a 55-gallon drum and dumped it outside a motel in Little Ferry, he claimed. He noticed the drum had vanished one day but never found out what had happened to it. Hoffman's remains were never found. Richard's burglary gang was being investigated by law enforcement by the early 1980s. Percy House, a gang member, was arrested in December 1982. House agreed to inform on Richard and was placed in protective custody. Arrest warrants were also issued for 2 other gang members, Gary Smith and Daniel Debner. Richard advised them to lay low and booked them a room at the York Motel in North Bergen, New Jersey. Smith left the motel to see his daughter, but Richard was concerned that Smith would become an informant after discussing going straight. According to Barbara Debner's testimony, Richard, Daniel Debner, and House, who was in jail at the time, decided that Smith had to be killed. Richard fed Smith cyanide-laced hamburger, but when that didn't work, Daniel Debner strangled Smith with a lamp cord. Richard relocated Debner to an apartment in Bergenfield, New Jersey, owned by Rich Patterson, the then fiancé of Richard's daughter, Merrick. Patterson was not present at the time, but he had keys to the apartment. Richard killed Debner between February and May 1983. Richard enlisted Patterson's assistance in disposing of Debner's body, telling Patterson that the victim was a friend in trouble with the law who had been murdered over the weekend. He went on to say that it was best to dump the body to avoid trouble with the cops and then forget about the incident. Richard made another blunder when he told an associate that he had murdered Debner. The body was discovered just 3 miles from the ranch where Kuklinski's family frequently went horseback riding. Debner was the third associate of Richard to be discovered dead. Louis Masquet's body was discovered near a town park near Clausland Mountain Road in Orangetown, New York, on September 25, 1983, with a bullet hole in the back of his head. Masquet vanished on July 1, 1981, the day he was supposed to meet Richard at a New Jersey diner to buy a large quantity of blank videocassette recorder tapes, for which Masquet had $95,000 in his van. His body was discovered 15 months later after being stored in a freezer. The discovery of Masquet's body prompted law enforcement officers to call him Iceman. Pat Kane, a New Jersey state police officer, became aware of Richard Kuklinski after an informant connected him to a gang committing burglaries in northern New Jersey. Kuklinski was eventually linked to 5 unsolved homicides: Hoffman, Smith, Debner, Masquet, and Maliband, because he was the last person to see each of them alive. The New Jersey Attorney General's office and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms formed a joint task force dubbed Operation Iceman with the goal of apprehending and convicting Kuklinski. The ATF was called in because of Kuklinski's firearm sales. To apprehend Kuklinski, ATF Special Agent Dominic Polifrone went undercover for 18 months. Kane and Polifrone began working with Phil Solomane, a close longtime friend of Kuklinski, in 1985 to get Polifrone close to Kuklinski. Polifrone purchased a handgun muffler combination from Kuklinski while posing as a Mafia-connected criminal named Dominic Provenzano. In audio recordings, Kuklinski discussed a corpse he kept in a freezer for 2.5 years. Polifrone was asked if he could supply him with pure cyanide. Polifrone told Kuklinski that he wanted to hire him to murder a wealthy Jewish cocaine dealer, and he recorded Kuklinski discussing his plans in detail. Kuklinski was also recorded bragging about killing a man by sprinkling cyanide on his hamburger and planning to kill a couple of rats, Barbara Debner and Percy House. On December 17, 1986, Richard met Polifrone to obtain cyanide. He went for a walk after a recorded conversation with Polifrone. He tested Polifrone's alleged cyanide on a stray dog with a hamburger as bait and discovered it was not poisonous. Suspicious, Richard decided not to carry out the planned murder and instead went home. 2 hours later, he was apprehended at a roadblock. For interfering with his arrest, his wife was charged with disorderly conduct. Officers discovered a firearm in the vehicle and charged her with firearm possession because she was a passenger. Richard was charged with 5 counts of murder and 6 weapons violations, as well as attempted murder, robbery, and attempted robbery. According to law enforcement, Richard had large sums of money in Swiss bank accounts and a flight reservation to that country. Richard was ordered to surrender his passport and held on a $2 million bail bond. Following his arrest, he told reporters, "This is unwarranted, unnecessary. These guys watch too many movies. At a press conference, New Jersey State Attorney General W. Carey Edwards described the murders as profitable, saying, "He set individuals up for business deals, they disappeared, and the money ended up in his hands." Richard's former associates, including Percy House and Barbara Debner, testified against him at trial, as did ATF Special Agent Polifrone. Deputy Attorney General Robert Carroll prosecuted the case, and Richard was represented by a public defender. Richard's attorney contended that he had no history of violence and only projected a tough image, including his statements to ATF Special Agent Polifrone. In March 1988, jurors found Richard Kuklinski guilty of murdering Smith and Debner, but they determined that the deaths were not caused by Richard's conduct, so he would not face the death penalty. He was later sentenced to at least 60 years in prison. Following the trial, Richard pled guilty to the murders of Mosque and Maliband. He was sentenced to 2 more life terms to be served consecutively. He would not be eligible for parole until he was 111 years old, in 2046. Richard was held at Trenton State Prison. Richard also claimed to be a Mafia contract killer who worked for all 5 New York City families as well as the DeCavalcante family in New Jersey. He claimed he committed dozens of murders on the orders of Gambino soldier Roy DeMeo. Richard claimed he was personally recruited for the Castellano murder by John Gotti ally, Sammy Gravano, who told him to kill Castellano's driver and bodyguard. He told Philip Carlo he was hired by John Gotti to kidnap, torture, and murder John Favara, the man who accidentally killed Gotti's 12-year-old son Frank after hitting him with his car. Other authorities, however, have disputed Richard's alleged involvement in Mafia hits. Sammy Gravano admitted to planning the murder of Castellano after becoming a government witness in 1990, but claimed the shooters were all members of John Gotti's crew and were chosen by Gotti. He did not mention Richard Kuklinski. Anthony Bruno, who wrote biographies of Richard, thought Richard's involvement in the murder of Castellano was highly unlikely. Bruno pointed out that Anthony Indelicato was convicted of Galanti's murder in 1986, but Kuklinski was never mentioned during the trial. Philip Carlo, Kuklinski's biographer, also admitted that Kuklinski's claim that he was involved in Galanti's murder was false. Richard Kuklinski was diagnosed with Kawasaki disease, an inflammation of the blood vessels, in October 2005, after nearly 18 years in prison. He was moved to St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey, to a secure wing. Although he had asked doctors to revive him if he went into cardiopulmonary arrest or was at risk of having a heart attack, his then-wife Barbara had signed a do not resuscitate order. The hospital called Barbara a week before his death to ask if she wanted to revoke the order, but she declined. Richard Kuklinski died of cardiac arrest on March 5, 2006, at the age of 70.